All right, friends, shalom, erev tov from Jerusalem. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. It's wonderful to see so many friends, so many colleagues, and people who are expressing their appreciation of our program by keep returning. It is very rewarding and encouraging. Today, the topic that we will be addressing is what do Israeli Jews really think about issues of religion and state, about the conflict, about pluralism, about diversity, about Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. Obviously, we will not be able to cover everything, but we'll be covering a lot. I'll say a few more introductory words in a minute, but before, let me just again express my gratitude and appreciation to our partners in co-sponsoring these webinars. The Hiddush, Rabbis and Cantors for Religious Freedom and Equality. And I see there may be more, but I see Rabbi Rachel Yurevich and Rabbi Neil Gold, who are two of our executive committee meetings, and there may be others. I apologize, I don't see you on the screen right now. And the JPLAN, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network, and actually we have all three co-chairs, Judge Peter Buxbaum and Mark Enshen from Toronto, and David Light from New Jersey. Ruach Hiddush, JPLAN, and the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. Thank you all, and we have not announced the next program yet. I'm just waiting. As you may know, tomorrow the Knesset starts its winter session, and a number of religion and state issues are on the agenda. And therefore, I'm just waiting a few days to see what will be the hottest issue, and we'll try to arrange the next couple of programs so that they will touch the current issues. So the reason why we chose to title the program, What Do Israeli Jews Really Think, is that often in my travels, I hear what you may also be hearing. I have family in Israel and they're telling me that. Or I have a friend in Israel who wrote me that. Or I met the minister or the MK and they said that. You will find that people mean well, but usually have a very narrow prism. Or, as in the case of politicians, very clear agenda and self-serving perspective. We at Hiddush have seen the importance of gauging, seriously, methodically gauging public opinion in Israel from the inception of Hiddush. Hiddush started in 2009, and right at the beginning, we ran a pre-launching major poll with 1,200 participants, representative sample of the adult Jewish population in Israel, and a series of focus groups. And we have since done the study every year. And on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, we publish our annual Israel Religion and State Index. You have all received email with the link to the program, to the report. I don't know whether you have sunk your teeth into it. If you have not yet, maybe you'll do after this webinar. It is the only consistent, periodical, in-depth, reliable review of public opinion in Israel on all matters of religion and state. Quite a number of the people on this webinar have been with us last year when I reviewed last year's index. And you will not be surprised to hear that on many of the issues there is a consistency. And you'll hear comparable findings But the unique aspects of this evening's webinar are that we are dealing with a new chapter in Israeli political life. And that new chapter is a unique coalition that's made of conflicting groups on a variety of issues, political issues, but also issues of religion and state. So when we will review the aspects of religion and state as seen through the prism of this year's Religion and State Index, I will be emphasizing a couple of things that will be different than what you may have heard or read in the past. One is, of course, the current political ramifications of the study. Not that the politicians will necessarily listen to their constituencies, to their voters, but I think it is very important for us to understand where their voters are and where the gap is, and possibly work together to do something about that gap. The other thing is that, unlike the Pew study that was published back in 2005, if I'm not mistaken, about views of Israelis on issues of religion and state, the sort of breakdown of the Israeli population that they used, and I'm not talking about the non-Jews, I'm talking about the Jewish community, was the traditional Haredi, religious, traditional, secular. But already about 15 years ago, the Central Bureau of Statistics suggested a subgroup, breaking down the traditional group into two subgroups, what is called in Hebrew Masorti Dati, traditional leaning toward religious, or Masorti Lo Kol Kach Dati, traditional not so religious. And this distinction is extremely important because often you will hear, well, as the politicians, especially of the last coalition, are known to be repeating, and now that they're in the opposition, they still repeat. Israeli society is mostly religious and traditional, and therefore they want Israel to be a Jewish state in the old way, in the traditional way. As you will see in our findings, nothing of the sort. But it is of great importance and interest to see where the traditional Jewish population is, and to realize that these two subgroups actually don't think alike and don't respond alike when it comes to matters of religion and state. Well, enough with generalizations. Let me just make two more comments and start the actual presentation. One is you are invited to post your comments, your questions on the chat. Since I'm speaking tonight, my more experienced in Zoom and other matters wife, Gary Regev, will be monitoring the chat, and when we finish the first part, she will be presenting to me and to you the questions that I will attempt to respond to. And the other is, this is of tremendous importance. We really want to serve you, whether you are community activists, whether you are rabbis or cantors, and you want to present the issues to the community, whether you want to write something about it, whether there are lawyers on this call who want to better understand the legal ramifications. So first of all, if there are lawyers on this call who are not yet members of the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network, write me and we'll gladly add you on. This is an opportunity for lawyers to stand up and be counted as supporting religious freedom and equality in Israel. But whatever your professional or personal interest is, don't hesitate to write us, ask, require, request further background information, further explanations. We are not ending the topic at the end of this webinar, and the chat is not the only avenue that you can raise your queries, comments, rebuttals, or questions. And with that, let me share the screen with the presentation and start right away. Just a second. All right. So one element that is really quite consistent, but those who have not seen it before will be interested in seeing it. Now, do you all see? You all see the division here of Israeli adult Jewish population based on the 2021 Israel Religion and State Index, which, as I said, we just released on the eve of Rosh Hashanah. And when you look at the breakdown of Israeli society in terms of religious identity, there are two ways of looking at it. This is one in which the Jewish population identifies itself as ultra-Orthodox, Dati, which we translated as Zionist Orthodox, Masorti Dati, traditional religious, Masorti lo kol kach Dati, traditional not so religious, and secular. And as you can see, about half of the adult Jewish population in Israel defines itself as secular, and together with the traditional not so religious, which, as you will see on. So, as I said, when you look at the breakdown of Israeli population in terms of the religious identity from secular to ultra-Orthodox, what you see is that about half are secular, and if you add to that the 17% that say we are traditional, not so religious, you come to 65% that share a view that is usually in support of religious freedom. So a significant majority of Israelis view themselves as non-religious, non-Orthodox, and share support for the concept of religious freedom. When you look at the political worldview, then you see a very different picture. What you see is, and you know, there are friends on this call, on this webinar, who, you know, we go back a long time, and there was a period of time in Israeli history when labor was the dominant political force, etc., etc. That's not been the case in many years. But the extent of this new reality is tremendous. Namely, as you can see, 47% define themselves politically as very right or right, with additional 21%, namely 68%, define themselves as either right of center or right or very right, as opposed to only 15% that define themselves as left-leaning or left, namely left of center or left. That's the political reality. So what we see is, on the one hand, 65% who say I'm secular or traditional, not religious, that usually share views of religious freedom. And what you see is 68% who say I'm right of center. And because this translates itself into political realities, as we will see momentarily, this, of course, has far-reaching consequences. And we need to understand and stress, as you will see again and again in the results of the survey, the fact that you may consider yourself to be right-wing politically does not mean that you are necessarily part of what has been described as the natural partnership or natural allies, השותפים הטבעיים of the right wing with the ultra-Orthodox, with the ultra-Orthodox parties. That is not the case, at least not in terms of the public, not in terms of the constituency. So one additional element that, of course, will interest many on this webinar is, okay, so we understand from ultra-Orthodox to secular, or from secular to ultra-Orthodox, but what about the pluralism? What about the non-Orthodox streams? So we asked a different question. And what you see here is that whereas 57% respond, I don't consider myself affiliated with any stream or Jewish denomination, and whereas 19% identify with or consider themselves affiliated with, even though they may not be Orthodox, but they feel affiliated with or identified with or aligned with Zionist Orthodox, 11% with ultra-Orthodox, which is more or less the percentage in the population. But what you see is that there is 6% who say Reform, 5% who say conservative, namely 11%. And the reality is that this figure is pretty consistent. Namely, somewhere between 10 and 13% of the adult Jewish population in Israel sees itself as identified with, aligned with, affiliated with. Different surveys have asked the question in different ways, but the result is more or less the same. Significant percentage considers itself to be part of the Reform conservative camp. Now, before I get notes and questions, in the index, I've actually explained it explicitly. It is not to suggest that Reconstructionist or renewal are insignificant. The reason why we did not include them in the question and in the survey is that you have to remember there is a 3.5% margin of error. Neither Reconstructionist nor renewal are at this stage sufficiently active in Israel to be known to the Israeli public. And therefore, the label is not sufficiently known to be relevant for a quantitative study. So the day may come, and I hope it comes, that we can include Reconstructionist and renewal, and it'll be relevant to the sample. So the other question, of course, is, which we are conveying to Israeli politicians, how does the vote break down in terms of religious identity? So let's look at labor, for instance. So 78% of labor voters define themselves as secular, with 16% traditional, not so religious, not close to religion. Blue and white, very interesting, tends to be stretched further into the traditional realm. So you see 68% of blue and white voters identify themselves as secular, 17% as traditional, not so religious, and 15% as traditional, close to religion. Yesh Atid, 80% secular, Meretz, 92%, Tikva Hadasha, Gidon Saar's party, New Hope, 53 and 28. And Israel Beitenu, as one could expect, 86% of its voters are secular. Now let's look at Yamina, Naftali Bennett's party, and religious Zionism, Smotrich's party, Hatzionut Datit. He was, his copywriting skills are significant. Politically, I've serious problems with it, but I certainly can appreciate his copywriting skill. So he took the name Hatzionut Datit, religious Zionism, and attached it to the party. Obviously, there are many other religious Zionists who don't consider themselves to be followers or disciples or supporters of Smotrich's party. But as you can see, there is a very significant difference between Yamina, that usually is perceived as a Zionist religious party, with some non-religious segments, represented, so to speak, by Ayelet Shaked, the Minister of the Interior. So the breakdown is very interesting. Whereas the religious Zionist party has 51% of its voters are religious Zionist, and only 5% secular, only 5% traditional, not so religious. With Yamina, it's much more balanced. You see 24% secular, 20% traditional, not so religious, so a much more balanced across the board party. Well, with Shas and United Torah Judaism, there is no surprise, and most of their voters are ultra-Orthodox or in the case of Shas, modern Orthodox, who vote for Shas not because they view Shas as a modern Orthodox party, but because of ethnic reasons, namely Sfaradim, who feel that this is, Sephardi pride and an obligation to vote for Shas. I included Likud to show you that the Likud breakdown is much more, again, balanced than the parties, whether it's Yesh Atid or Israel Beitenu or Blue and White, that are leading the current coalition. Yet, again, what you will see is that only 15% of the modern Orthodox and only 1% of the Haredi vote for it. What's important is to look at the undecided, because in the Religion and State Index, we are looking to see what do the undecided feel, because the way they feel, now what does undecided mean? That at the time of the poll, they have not made up their mind yet as to whom they are going to vote for. So if parties, and of course all parties, would want the undecided to side with them, but it's important to see who they are religiously and how do they feel about our issues. And the question is whether the potential pursuers, namely the parties that will go after their vote, are going to be responsive to their interest in trying to attract their support and their vote. So as you can see, 75% of the undecided are either secular or traditional, not close to religion. And bear that in mind when you see some of the subsequent questions. So, do Israelis support religious freedom? And often I'm asked the question, all right, why don't you push for separation of religion and state? And without getting into the merits of the question of whether separation of religion and state defeats Israel or not, I think it is of tremendous importance to note that when you present the public with these two options, namely freedom of religion, Chofesh Dat u'Matzpun, freedom of religion and conscience, as promised in Israel's Declaration of Independence, or separation of religion and state, what you see is a significantly higher percentage, 81%, who say, yes, I support religious freedom. Namely, implementing, making religious freedom in Israel real so that everyone can choose. And when you see the support for separation of religion and state, it is a majority. It has grown over the years, but it's 59%. Big difference between the support for one and the support for the other. So if we look at the level of support based on the religious identity, what you see as expected is that only 13% of the ultra-Orthodox, 18% of the Zionist Orthodox support separation of religion and state. And again, you may ask the question, why do they support separation? You know, we can relate to that. I want to not, pause to get into that at this time. But 51% of the ultra-Orthodox say, yes, we support religious freedom because they understand religious freedom as a concept that's meant to defend and safeguard and ensure their rights as well. But when you look at the right side of the slide, the secular and the traditional not so religious, you see a fuller picture of why the support for religious freedom in Israel is so great. Because 95% of the secular and 90% of the traditional not so religious say, yes, we support, we want freedom of religion and conscience. Tremendous majority of these two groups that make up 65% of the Israeli adult Jewish population. Now, this is already one opportunity for you to see the difference between the traditional not religious and the traditional leaning toward religious. 90% of the first group are saying we support religious freedom compared to only 64% of the more religious-leaning traditionalists. So lumping all traditional Jews together, you'll see here and you'll see further down, has no basis whatsoever. Misleading presentation. Now, how is support for these concepts reflected in the way that the voters for the different parties are? I won't spend time, but as you can see, all the coalition parties, including Yamina, 86%, all the coalition parties support religious freedom by a great majority. Now, often we are asked the question, but do Israelis really care? Do they care about the conflict of religion and state? And we have been asking this question repeatedly every year, and this is the 13th survey, the 13th report. And in a minute, you'll see the comparative presentation. But the top acute conflicts in Israeli society, when we ask, there are a number of domestic tensions in Israeli society, we stress domestic tensions. We are not talking about peace and security here. We're asking about domestic issues. The top two are the conflict of political left and political right, and the conflict of secular versus ultra-Orthodox. All the others, including the conflicts and the tension that is now played up by a number of people in Israel, again, I think often self-serving, namely between Sfaradim and Ashkenazim, between people of Arab countries' descent and Western descent. In the eyes of the public, both Sfaradim and Ashkenazim, this is not a significant conflict, not a significant tension. As you can see, only 4% say this is the most important conflict, most acute conflict, and 11% say it's the second most important, namely only 15% say it's a significant acute conflict in Israeli society, compared to 71 and 76% that refer that way, that refer to religion and state, and to political left and political right as being such acute conflicts. And here you can see from 2011 onwards, and you see that for the most part, it's consistent. The conflict between rich and poor is on significant decline, even though Israel has tremendous economic gaps, but it's on a decline. The issues of political left and political right has risen. It used to be significantly lower than religion and state or Haredi and secular. As you can see, it was about 50% back in 2011, and it rose alongside with the recriminations and the growing violent language and violent approaches to the political arena, which is extremely unfortunate. But with it, that conflict has risen in the mind of the public in terms of its acuteness, but with religion and state being sort of alongside with it. At some points along the way, there were more people who felt that religion and state, Haredi and secular, are, the more threatening conflict in Israel society. But as you can see, they sort of continue sort of hand in hand. Now, when you look again at the way that people hold these two conflicts, right and left, and secular and Orthodox, along according to the voting patterns, you again get a very clear picture. Let's look at Yisrael Beitenu, for instance. They care less about left and right, but 86% hold the Haredi secular conflict as being the most acute. Whereas in the Likud, it's the other way around. The Likud has certainly, breathed, I shouldn't say breathed air, but they breathed, petrol into this conflict. And so 81% of Likud voters say it's the battle between left and right. That's the most acute issue, most threatening issue, compared to only 59, still a majority, that holds so about religion and state. Now, so what's the connection between religion and politics? As you can see, 73% of the ultra-Orthodox say I'm very right or right politically. 78% of modern Orthodox, Zionist Orthodox, say I'm very right or right. And it goes down with the secular being sort of divided among all political camps. 29 on the right, 21 center right, 22 center, 28 left or center left. So it is important to understand that there is a clear correlation between religious views and political views. And the more you move into the Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox camps, the more you are likely to identify yourself as right-wing politically. So the alliance between the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox parties, and Netanyahu and the Likud is not just because he's giving them what they want in terms, or has given them what they want in terms of the what we call in Hebrew kneidlach, namely the goodies, but also because there is an intrinsic political leaning of their constituency in the direction of the right-wing camp. Now, so the question is, with that in mind, how do Israeli Jews feel about the sort of ongoing pressure to bring the ultra-Orthodox parties on board into the coalition? And what you see is that clear majority, 59%, are saying, no, we don't want the ultra-Orthodox parties in the coalition, or we don't want them to be in a position where they can call the shots, even if on Jewish affairs. But all the coalition parties, from Yamina, through Israel Beitenu, through New Hope, through Meretz, through Yesh Atid, through Blue and White, through Labor, all of them, the majority of their voters don't want the ultra-Orthodox to be in the coalition. And the reality is, if you are reading the news coming from Israel, both Yamina and to a great degree Yesh Atid, Lapid and his people, are actually reaching out, talking behind the scenes to the ultra-Orthodox, hoping to win them over. And in all likelihood, willing to pay a very heavy toll to bring them on board. So this is one of the clearest conflicts or gaps between public opinion that don't want to see them there. They want a civil coalition, a wide civil coalition. And the politicians, even in the current coalition, who are willing to pay the price, and I should have mentioned Gantz as well. Gantz, who, if you remember our webinars from the election period, Gantz, who at a certain point said, you know, a strong blue and white means a secular state. Namely, only if I am going to get your support, I'm going to be able to ensure that there's going to be a secular government. Memshala Chilonit, secular government. He's come a long way since then. Those ads went down very quickly, and his views have moved very quickly. Okay, here is something that's very important for activists, communal leaders in the Jewish communities outside Israel to understand. In the coalition agreements, there were a number of elements involving religion and state that were listed in the agreements. Some of them were agreed upon by all the parties. and were included in what is called the basic agreement between Yesh Atid and Yamina. Some of them appear in individual coalition agreements between Yesh Atid and Labor, Yesh Atid and New Hope, Yesh Atid and Israel Beiteinu, etc. We listed all these items in the poll. We included them here in 2 slides. So the one that the public sees as most important to them to advance is allowing public transportation on Shabbat. Again, I don't have the time to go into deeper explanation why that is the case. But if you see, the top issues are public transportation on Shabbat, enforcing co-curricular studies in the ultra-Orthodox schools, and cutting their budgets if they are not going to meet that requirement, and the registration of marriage, well, Brit Zugiyut, the sort of cohabitation bill, the covenant of couplehood, however you want to call it, that some of the coalition parties are trying to push. They are not willing, Labor is, but others are not, to move further into freedom of marriage yet, so they call it registration of marriage contracts, of these couplehood agreements. These are the 3 top issues in terms of what Israeli adult Jews consider as important. Close to it is the LGBTQ equal rights. But what's at the bottom? At the bottom is the item that was included in some of the agreements. And you know, some of the Israeli ministers have spoken about their commitment to see it through, including Dr. Nachman Shai, who spoke here 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, and dedicated quite a bit of time to explaining his support for the Kotel agreement, and Lieberman, Avigdor Lieberman of Israel Beiteinu, etc. But here is the true reality. The true reality, the average Israeli adult Jew couldn't care less. Yes, there is support. There is wide support, but it is not considered to be an important issue. I think it's important for us to put this in context. But one additional element that should be remembered is we gave the option of none, namely none of these religion and state reforms is of importance to us. And we were very encouraged to see that only 19% are saying none of that is important to me. So one thing or the other or both or whatever is important to different segments in the adult Jewish population in Israel. Less than 20% say, you know what, issues of religion and state are of no importance to me. And you remember that I spoke before on the undecided. Are the issues of religious freedom or religion and state relevant when Israelis come to vote? Is that something that they bear in mind, and does it influence them in supporting a party that pushes these issues, or weakens their interest or their commitment to support that party? So we gave 3 options. If a party commits to pursue religious freedom in its agenda and political work, is that going to be increasing the likelihood that you will support it, decreasing the likelihood, or it won't make a difference? And as you can see, for the secular public, 79% say that's going to raise the likelihood of my supporting it. And among the traditional not so religious, 50%. Now, you remember that key parties in the coalition are mostly supported by secular and traditional not so religious. So combining the two, namely who are the people who vote for those parties that are competing among themselves, and what do secular and traditional not religious individuals think about, does it have a political consequence, these issues of religion and state? You will see that a smart and sophisticated politician in Israel on that side of the political camp would be wise to upgrade the place of issues of religious freedom in their agenda and in their campaigning. Back to the question of pluralism. So do Israelis support pluralism? Do they support equal rights? And again, we asked about the three largest denominations, and we made it clear that this is not because they specifically support Reform and Conservative. Those who read the newsletter we sent out on Thursday know that Reform is really a generic name. Not only is, in the eyes of most Israelis, conservative coming down under the sort of label of Reform, but they call the opposition, the opponents, the Haredi parties, call the government a Reform government. They call Bennett, and they call the Minister of Religious Services, Kahana, Reform. So there is a generic label called Reform. But the important thing to understand is, yes, clear majority, 61% are saying we support equal rights, equal status in Israel for all the denominations. I think that I'll pause now. We will be sending the PowerPoint presentation to all of you who registered for this webinar, but maybe we'll pause now, and I'll ask Gary to tell me if there are any questions that have already come up in the chat before we continue.
So there's a question from Neil Gold about the desire to see ethnic breakdowns among the different religious ideologies. For instance, are the numbers of Sfaradim or Mizrahim who identify as traditional religious or traditional non-religious markedly different than Ashkenazim? There's part two. Do the Mizrahim respond to a separation of religion and state in demographically different ways than Ashkenazim?
Okay, so Rabbi Neil Gold is, putting his finger on a very relevant issue. I don't have the numbers for that, in part because it's very difficult at this point to say who is Sfaradi. There are so many mixed marriages between Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. There are so many who say, don't put these labels on me. I'm an Israeli. I'm a second generation Israeli. I'm a third generation Israeli. Who are you to tell me that I'm Sfaradi or Ashkenazi? Very difficult these days. But the point is that you are right. You are right in suggesting that there is a correlation. Namely, yes, Sfaradim tend to be more traditional, and therefore they would come more of those who identify themselves as traditional, leaning toward religion, would be Sfaradim than Ashkenazim. And yes, more of them would have an issue with gender equality, with reform, which of course in none of the Arab countries was there an established reform. They are not familiar with it. What they have seen is mostly in Israel. It's a changing picture, but generally speaking, you are right. There is more traditionalism on the Sephardic side and less so on the Ashkenazi side.
There was a third part of his question to you, and that is that he says, I think that they are, the question of the Sfaradim, whether they're different from the Ashkenazim, and that the failure of American Jews to speak the language of Mizrahi Jews is a big part of the divide between American Jews and Israelis.
I am not sure. I don't consider myself an expert on language issues. I think that the issue is not so much for American Jews to speak the language of Sephardi or of Mizrahi, as it is to be more invested on the ground in Israel in terms of supporting the on-the-ground grassroots organizations that struggle for a Jewish and democratic state which is inclusive, which is pluralistic, etc. Neither the reform nor the conservative movements have made it a real priority as yet. There is quite a bit of talk about it, but in terms of dollars, there really isn't that much investment in terms of promoting the advocacy, not compared to other advocacy efforts. I can tell you that, for instance, one of the advocacy think tanks, Kohelet, that has risen in recent years, supported mostly by funds from the US, and spending, if I remember correctly, $5 million on advocacy a year, advocacy, right-wing advocacy. There is nothing compared to that on the pluralism spectrum. There are no major donors who feel that promoting pluralism, whether it is pluralism, whether it's concrete issues such as freedom of marriage, whether it's the issues that you're alluding to, namely outreach to Sfaradim, by increasing the number of Sfaradim who go on the exchange programs, by maintaining contact with Sfaradim who come as counselors for summer camps in the Reform or Conservative movement, a variety of ways of outreach. It just doesn't register as a priority. So, Neil, I'm with you in terms of a missed opportunity. I don't think it's mostly the language. I think it's a general lack of advocacy, a programmatic, strategic outlook.
Yaakov Rabkin asks, what does the right mean if you exclude relations with Palestinians and the concern with economic disparity is so low?
Well, Yaakov, you're right. I mean, there are different ways to look at the division of right and left. It goes back to the French Revolution and where they sat in the, in the parliament. But I would suggest that when you talk about left and right in Israel today, it is mostly about the issues of the peace process, territories, settlements, and security. These are the key issues that divide left from right. But as I'm saying that, the interesting thing that we spoke about in previous webinars is that you look at the current government, that is a coalition that ranges from Yamina, that certainly rejects, as Naftali Bennett explained recently, rejects the notion of a two-state solution, wouldn't meet with Abu Mazen, to Ram, the Islamist party. So I think that there is sort of a balancing act in this coalition that defies the traditional division between left and right. I think they realize that, A, security-wise, most Israelis are on the right of center, as I've demonstrated at the beginning. So with all respect to the left and with appreciating all the efforts that are being made, and by the way, a lot more money goes into promoting the left, V15 and a variety of avenues have been developed that channeled financial support for the left. None of that can significantly address the mindset of the average Israeli today. Why is it that way? Clearly, this is not something that has been with Israel from its inception. For decades, the majority of Israelis were on the left or on the left of center. And therefore, clearly, this may not be going far into the future. It can change. But the change, since we are talking about issues of left and right, as the question was, posed, the change will not be by PR stunts. It will be by some significant change on the ground, in the actual configuration of the forces on the Palestinian side, on the Israeli side, on the international side. None of that seems to present itself at present, and therefore, I think that we need to contend with a realization that for some time into the future, the majority of Israelis will identify themselves politically as right. Therefore, It is the balanced coalition that optimizes the ability of maintaining a more balanced policy and the need to focus on a key issue, existential issue, that goes to the core of Israel's identity as a Jewish and democratic state, namely, how does it handle the conflict of religion and state? How does it handle the promise of its founding document, the Declaration of Independence, that speaks of freedom of religion and conscience and equality regardless of religion? On that, unlike the division of left and right, unlike questions about settlements and the peace process and security, etc., the overwhelming majority of Israelis are with us. They want religious freedom. They want equality. They want pluralism. They don't want the ultra-Orthodox parties to call the shots and determine who is Jewish and who is not. And that is actually, one question that I will point out to you, or one finding that I'll point out to you, because it's of tremendous importance, again, on who is a Jew issue. And this is where we are at now. And that is the area where most of the potential for change that will go a long way both in healing and advancing Israeli democracy and in healing the rift between Israel and world Jewry, which is, as you know better than I do, mostly non-Orthodox, mostly pluralistic, mostly embracing religious freedom. Were there any other questions, Gary?
There are two more questions.
Go ahead.
Okay, the first one is from Alan Warshaw, wants to know about defining, please, the three groups that you called Orthodox.
Okay, and what's the second question?
The second question is from Ira.
Yes.
Why haven't the Israeli reform and conservative movements organized to transform the majority support for their issues into political power? And if you thought that was the end, Michael Livney has a question too. Okay.
So, Alan, the three terms that we have are the following. First of all, these ultra-Orthodox. Now, one may think that ultra-Orthodox is one homogeneous group, nothing of the sort. There is, of course, Ashkenazim ultra-Orthodox and Sfaradim ultra-Orthodox. They are Hasidic and they are the Litvishers, the Lithuanian yeshiva world, etc. And just so that you not make any mistake, there is no love lost between them. And suffice it to say that I am following the ultra-Orthodox media regularly, and sometimes there are very harsh words exchanged between the groups. And within Agudat Israel and between Agudat Israel and the yeshiva world, etc., no great harmony there. But they're all ultra-Orthodox. And one element that I think that diaspora Jewry does not sufficiently appreciate is, in being ultra-Orthodox, they're all somewhere between anti-Zionist and non-Zionist. When you don't listen to their political speeches at the Knesset, but you read their literature, you will realize all of them reject the legitimacy of Zionism. Many of them reject the legitimacy of the State of Israel. All of them reject the legitimacy of an independent civil judiciary, etc., etc. I mean, there is an issue here that the leadership of diaspora Jewry isn't willing to even touch, because they realize that's not a pleasant picture. But on the other hand, if you don't touch it, if you don't understand the essence, why is there such an animosity on the part of most Israelis to the ultra-Orthodox joining the government coalition? It is because the Israelis feel that they are being bulldozed, that they are being coerced, that core concepts of democracy, of gender equality, of freedom of choice, etc., are being denied, not because there is any intrinsic legitimacy to denying them, but because politicians on the right, center, and left are bowing before the demands of the ultra-Orthodox. So that is part of the background as to why so many Israelis feel this is such an acute conflict in Israeli society. The second group is the Zionist Orthodox, that's modern Orthodox. Now, we have not spoken about it here, but the interesting thing is that within modern Orthodoxy, both as we see, for instance, in Rabbis for Religious Freedom and Equality in Israel, we have on the executive committee and among our members a number of modern Orthodox rabbis who are clearly committed to their orthodoxy, but at the same time, as Rabbi Mark Angel, who together with me drafted the vision statement on Israel as a Jewish democratic state, explained at one public meeting that we had, he said, I believe that in the truth of the Torah. I believe that the Torah is the way the Jews should observe and act. And I will do everything possible to convince fellow Jews that this is the right way to go. But just as I do that, I realize that it's unlikely that I will convince everybody of the truth of the Torah and the truth of my approach. And I'm committed to ensure that until that happens, everyone will get the same acknowledgement, the same rights, the same entitlements as I demand for myself. So what you find now is more and more, both within American modern Orthodoxy and within Israeli Zionist Orthodoxy, who hold that view. And in our surveys, what we see is that there is approximately a 15 to 20% of modern Orthodoxy that says, I'm Orthodox, but I support public transportation on Shabbat. I'm Orthodox, but I support that the state of Israel recognizes all conversions. And then there is a third sort of splinter group that we call Chardali, Haredi Leumi, which is sort of Haredi Zionist Orthodox. They are Zionist. It's a smaller group within modern Orthodoxy that is close mentally, emotionally, and intellectually to the ultra-Orthodox. In many ways, Smotrich represents them. So these are the three subgroups within Orthodoxy. And Ira, your question, obviously, every few years we ask ourselves that question. Namely, with so many Israelis supporting religious freedom and pluralism, etc., why not translate it into a political plan? And the reality is that when you are talking about ultra-Orthodox, the answer is very simple. Whoever the Rabbi says you should vote for, or the yeshiva head says you should vote for, that's whom you vote for. There is no question. You don't disobey your rabbinic leader. And that's why we see a great consistency in terms of United Torah Judaism. And again, I could speak a lot more about it, but that's not, we don't have the time. When you come to Reform or Conservative Jews, tell me, does your average rabbi in the community feel that they have the ability to urge her congregants to vote that party or the other party? Not in the least. People are divided. They have their own minds. There are a variety of issues that influence their vote. What the rabbi tells them is probably the least important in terms of the order of priorities of how I should vote and whom I should vote for. That's my assessment. I may be totally wrong. You may actually know, numerous communities in which it's really the rabbi that can swing the vote one way or another. I can tell you that both the Reform movement in Israel and the conservative movement in Israel hold variety of views on security and territorial issues and in economic issues. And it's unlikely, that the movements would be able to sort of coax their congregants to vote in a particular way, there isn't enough critical mass in the congregations to make for the minimum votes that are necessary in order to pass the threshold. And as you recall, the threshold at this point is 3.25%, namely either you get enough votes for 4 Knesset members or else you lose everything. And most importantly, the many, and I assume the majority of members in the reform movement, for instance, don't want the movement to be associated with politics. They come to the movement for a variety of reasons, but not in order to pursue a political partisan path. And the last is, truth of the matter is, yes, the last elections have shown that with 4 Knesset members, you can actually transform the face of politics. At what price? What would the movement say in terms of a peace process? Is there one view among Reform and Conservative Jews as to how the peace process should be pursued? What kind of territorial concessions should be made? There isn't. If the Reform Conservative Party organizes around the concept of religious freedom or pluralism, what is it that we are going to do? The same as the ultra-Orthodox, namely put up our votes for sale to the highest bidder? It's a mess. And I think that the fact that our movements have refrained from embracing a partisan political path was a wise choice, and I believe still is a wise choice. All right, let me just finish with who is a Jew, because I realize that our time has sort of run. So who is a Jew is the question that has engaged both people throughout the diaspora and in Israel over the years. Every 10 years or so, there has been a crisis. In the mid-70s, the mid-80s, the mid-90s, the mid-2000s. And, we did a session on who is a Jew. Many of you remember Rabbi Ira Yudovin, who's, just asked the last question, has been right in the middle of those battles for many of those, phases, many of those chapters, and others on this call. But in recent years, the question within Israel has taken on a new phase. We now have about 15% of the population that have come from the former Soviet Union. Statistically, about 400,000 of them are not halachically Jewish. They reside in Jewish communities, in Jewishly, dominated condominiums. They work in the same workplace. They go to the same schools, etc., but they are not halachically Jewish. So these issues came to the fore in recent weeks, for instance, with the gold medal winner, who, is an Israeli. I can't pronounce his last name. Artyom is his first name. Great pride. The president called him, the prime minister called him. His mother was interviewed, and she said in the course of the interview, there is something that troubles me, because here is my son who has brought so much, honor to Israel and is celebrated so widely. I am not Jewish. My husband is Jewish. So Artyom is the son of a Jewish father and non-Jewish mother. He is an Israeli citizen under the law of return. He can't marry. He has a girlfriend. She's not halachically Jewish either. They can't get married in Israel. And we asked 2 questions. We asked about the marriage, and clearly, like the question that I think I showed you before, but the 2/3 of the Israeli adult Jews say, yes, there should be freedom of marriage in Israel. Israel should recognize all forms of marriage equally, including the majority of all the voters of the coalition parties. But we ask the question now, for the 2nd or 3rd time, do you consider such an individual who lives in Israel in a Jewish environment, considers himself or herself Jewish, has been integrated into the Jewish society, do you consider such a person as a Jew from a civil perspective? Namely, Israel should grant recognition to such an individual as a Jew. Or is it about conversion? Without conversion, you will not and cannot be accepted as a Jew, even for civil purposes in Israel. And if conversion, well, what about the demand, which is one of the key political battles now in Israel? If you're following the news from Israel, the chief rabbinate and Smotrich and others, namely, the only conversions they say that should be recognized are those that are recognized by the chief rabbinate. Even other modern Orthodox conversions they view as treif. As, you know, they are Gentiles, they were Gentiles before that conversion, they are Gentiles after the conversion. And whom are we talking about? We are talking about rabbis like Riskin, like Amsalem, like Stav. Namely, should it be just the chief rabbinate or other alternative conversions, whether Reform, Conservative, Modern Orthodox, etc.? So here is the breakdown. And we have asked the question back in 2020 and now again in 2021. Let's look at the 2021. So a third, so it's about a third. A third are saying, as far as I'm concerned, an individual whose father or grandfather was Jewish and is integrated into Jewish society and considers himself or herself Jewish, the state of Israel should accept him as a Jew for, you know, in the civil realm. Then 30% are saying, no, conversion should be required, but any conversion. It could be modern Orthodox, Reform, Conservative. And yes, again, you know, we didn't ask, but I'm sure that the same would apply to Reconstructionist and Renewal. Only 35% are saying Israel should be recognizing only those that have been converted with the approval of the chief rabbinate. So as you can see, 2/3 say the chief rabbinate is not the decisor of who is Jewish. So again, when we pursue the battle over who is a Jew, we need to understand that the overwhelming majority of Israeli Jews are with us. They don't want the monopoly of the chief rabbinate any more than you do. All right, I think we have exceeded the desirable time. I see that there are additional things on the chat, but I think that we have...
There's one major question. The others are back and forth. The question is Michael Langer, and it's very typical. Livni, sorry. The elephant in the room is the Zionist purpose of Israel's existence. We are a people, one people, said Herzl. The ultra-Orthodox are not Zionist.
Well, yes, I think that the question of one people and the question of peoplehood certainly does not receive the kind of focus and attention that it should. 3 weeks ago, when the Minister of Diaspora Affairs, Dr. Nachman Shai, spoke, you may recall his initial major focus was on establishing the big tent in which everybody has a place and in which the Orthodox, non-Orthodox, etc., all relevant paths should be able to find equal acceptance and equal space under this big tent. I wish that the organized Jewish community, the leadership of the Jewish community, were to pursue this with the following proviso. Namely, to the extent that you acknowledge the Jewish unity is not to be confused with Jewish uniformity. Namely, we are one people, one family, and like many families, we are very diverse in our choices, in our practices, in our beliefs, to the extent that that were the basis. And those who care about the strengthening of the Jewish people and understand the importance of Jewish peoplehood for the state of Israel would translate that into an unequivocal demand from Israeli governments that should inform the policies on all matters of religion and state and the interpretation, the application of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. If that were the case, if there was significant pressure on we are undermining the Jewish people, if we are allowing a policy or laws that say you are a good Jew and you're a second-class Jew and you're a third-class Jew, we are undermining the Jewish people, we are undermining Zionism, and we are undermining the state of Israel. So if there is one message that I hope you have seen, accepted, taken in this, the part of the presentation and whatever you manage to read in the Religion and State Index, it is this notion of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state that celebrates the promise of religious freedom and equality. That's not a reform banner. It's not a conservative banner. It's not a reconstructionist or renewal banner. This is the foundational banner of the state of Israel that not only is widely supported throughout the Jewish communities of the diaspora, it is widely supported in Israel by Israelis. We are on the same page. Don't let anybody tell you, I have a family in Israel that tell me, no, none of these issues really make any difference, or that's the way Israeli politics are, etc., etc. None of that is true. Our consistent surveys of Israeli public opinion, which don't stand alone. You can look at the Israel Democracy Institute surveys. You can look at the surveys done by the Central Bureau of Statistics and others. Whenever sporadic questions are asked about these issues, the Jewish People Public Policy Institute, sponsored by the Jewish Agency, all of them come down to the same point that we are making. All of them come down to the same point that I am making, namely, to the extent that this is going to be our focus as an organized Jewish community, that we understand that politically, security-wise, settlements-wise, there's probably little that we can do to make a difference. But we can make tremendous difference on the Jewish character. We can make tremendous difference on the quality of democracy and on religious freedom in a way that would heal so much of the rift, of the friction between Israel and the rest of the Jewish people. Thank you for those who stayed with us. And as I said before, don't hesitate to write me with additional questions, asking for further background. We'll be sending you this PowerPoint presentation. I urge you to look at the Religion and State Index, the actual report. So much of that is analyzed there. And we'll shortly inform you of the next webinar, which will deal with some of those current issues that are on, moving to the front burner in the Knesset. Thanks to Hiddush, to J-Plan, to the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, and to all of us, and to all of you who support Hiddush. Shalom and lehitraot.
Lehitraot.